Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to introduce myself in just a moment. My name is Ashley Sawyer. I am an attorney and the Senior Director of Campaigns at a Brooklyn, New York-based nonprofit called Girls for Gender Equity. And I'm extremely delighted to be having this very timely webinar and conversation with all of you entitled Police in Schools, Racial Justice and True Student Safety. This webinar is sponsored by the American Bar Association section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. And this panel is also a part of a series of rapid response webinars. The American Bar Association is actively planning additional programming on a number of issues. So you can go to americanbar.org/CRSJ for additional updates and to learn more about other programs. So as folks continue to join, I would ask for you to, I think you will already be muted, so I won't give you any of those sort of traditional housekeeping, but I hope folks know that you can use the question and answer function to ask questions of myself and the panelists today. So you won't be using the chat function, you use the Q&A function, and you can start to drop your questions in as we go along, and then we will be reserving 30 minutes for Q&A from the audience, all of you. So really excited that to some extent, this will be somewhat of an interactive conversation. And with that, I will just briefly introduce our panelists. Today we have with us Ky'Eisha Penn, who is a staff attorney at Advancement Project. We have Miriam A. Rowland, who is an attorney and director of the Education Civil Rights Alliance at the National Center for Youth Law. We have another Miriam S., a recent high school graduate and now paralegal at Integrate NYC's Peer Defense Program. And then we will shortly be joined by Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers. And as I mentioned, my name is Ashley Sawyer, and I am the Senior Director of Campaigns at a nonprofit called Girls for Gender Equity. I am also an attorney who has been representing young people who have been system involved for a little bit of time. So with that, I will begin my presentation and just kind of lay some foundation and some context about the movement for police-free schools and what this is all about. And then after that, we will shift very quickly to the second panelist, Miriam R. So I'm going to say Miriam R just because we have two Miriams with us today. So for context, I think it's really important that this month folks know that there was the largest protest against police presence in schools in history. On June 5th, young people gathered at Washington Square Park in New York City for an unprecedented gathering of folks who were actively working to dismantle the school to prison pipeline, dismantle youth criminalization, and dismantle the ways that anti-Blackness, racism, transphobia show up through the system of policing in New York City public schools and really throughout the country. And that protest on June 5th obviously happened before we even knew we would be having this conversation, but I think it's an important piece of context to know that students, young people, and parents and teachers have been coming together to demand that police be removed from their schools for a myriad of reasons, which you'll hear about today. You'll learn about the civil rights reasons as it relates to the laws that are intended to protect students and the ways that policing shows up and disproportionately punishes, arrests, and criminalizes Black students, Latinx students, Indigenous students across the country. In my work, I have been able to work alongside young people from the largest school district in the country, New York City Public Schools, who are actively involved in trying to transform their schools to be healing centered, to demand that New York City set precedent for the country by investing in restorative justice practitioners in every single school. Restorative justice practitioners are not just people who keep circle, although keeping circle is an ancient tradition that many communities have done to hold folks accountable or invite people into accountability, but also restorative practitioners create the kind of environment where students feel safe, heard, and affirmed, and where adults and students build the kinds of relationships where the students and the adults feel like they are safe and they are able to access the resources that they need for their safety. Students have also been demanding mental health supports and mental health resources. One of the things that often comes up in the conversation around police-free schools is an overemphasis on counseling and mental health to sort of justify removing police from schools, to sometimes imply that every time a student gets in trouble, it's because they were going through a mental health crisis. When in some cases, many cases, as I've seen as an attorney, students get in trouble with police in their schools just because they are doing the things that normal youth do, that children do. And I think that's an important part of our conversation. While there are certainly times where students look for or need mental and emotional health support, we also know that students, particularly students of color, and in many parts of the country, I really do want to center Black students and Indigenous students, they are criminalized just for laughing and playing. They are criminalized for the clothing that they wear or for the clothing that they're not wearing. They are criminalized because of their gender presentation. And so the students want to also be able to attend school and be free and just be themselves, free from the constraints created by anti-Blackness and homophobia and transphobia and just ageism. So those are some of the reasons that I've met students who want to dismantle the way the school to prison pipeline shows up through policing. Many people in the conversation often say, well, how will we keep students safe? And the research has shown that policing has not actually made students or schools any safer. In fact, when we have studied and had conversations with students, the research shows that actually they feel safer when their schools are well-resourced, when their schools have ample resources for the types of supports that I just mentioned, restorative justice practitioners, mental health supports, if they need mental health support, social emotional learning, classrooms with culturally relevant curriculum. That part is a piece that's often missed out. Students feel more engaged, more excited about, and more willing to participate in the school and the school climate when they see themselves reflected in the curriculum. Students have also said they need food, right? Students who are struggling with hunger and poverty also need the supports that schools should already have. When we have abundantly resourced schools that are with culturally competent staff and educators, we can imagine what safety can look like. As an attorney, I'll quickly shift. In my experience, I have had the distinct privilege, really, of working alongside students who were being suspended from school or being criminalized in New York City. And some of those young people, I was able to stand by their side as they were experiencing push out in their school. And I also had the unfortunate experience of meeting with staff who had done harm to clients that I worked with and watching surveillance video of school police in New York City dragging students by their arms into buildings, harming students, brutalizing students. At Girls for Gender Equity, I saw what I saw in anecdote with individual clients play out through data. One of the resources that we'll drop into the chat sometime today is an interactive map.
I believe I just lost my audio, but here we are, an interactive map that my colleagues at Girls for Gender Equity created, showing numerous incidents where girls of color specifically had been assaulted by school police. Many of you might recall in 2015, a young Black girl was thrown from her desk in her classroom onto the floor by a school police officer that was invited in by her school teacher for not taking out her headphones, which actually I'm about to take out mine now. And that young person was experiencing family conflict and had put her head down on her desk. And because the teacher just wanted her to lift her head up and take her headphones out, and again, this is what I'm talking about when I say not every student needs like a mental health professional. Sometimes students just need to be allowed to rest their head and keep their head down or have autonomy over their physical body. But in Spring Valley, South Carolina, the incident went viral where the student was slammed to the ground by the school cop. And that set off a series of conversations about the ways that Black girls specifically are harmed by policing. And it also continued, started off some of the work that Ky'Eisha, who you'll hear about today, who we'll hear from today, from Advancement Project, started the hashtag Assault At campaign to track incidents where youth had been harmed by policing in their schools. Girls for Gender Equity, where I work, we have narrowed that list down specifically to incidents of girls of color because they are often left out of the conversation around the school to prison pipeline and criminalization more broadly. When you look at that interactive map, you'll see incidents from across the country and incidents from even during the pandemic. Black girls harmed by school police in Florida, one young girl knocked unconscious by a school cop. And so as we look at these incidents, it has continued to put pressure on those of us who care about civil rights, those of us who care about racial justice, those of us who care about young people, to create the types of environments where young people can feel safe, affirmed, included, and loved in their school environments. And we know that that cannot be possible if they are constantly under threat of criminalization, if they are constantly under threat based upon their race, and if they are constantly under threat that any mistake that they make, real or perceived, is going to be the basis for a juvenile record or an adult record that follows them throughout their lives. So with that ground, I hope I've laid some of the groundwork and some of the foundation. I hope that you all will take some time to look at the resources that will be shared via the chat, and I assume after today's event. I am so excited for you all to get connected to this information. I think that in many cases, attorneys don't often get to hear from people who are doing organizing work, and we often don't get to hear from students and young people. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from and centering Miriam S. in our conversation, so that we're hearing from the young people who know most about what this experience is like. With that, I will shift to Miriam R. And I will also, I see in the chat, I will also share that resource. Thank you so much. Miriam.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thank you to all of the presenters here today and all of you as participants. As Ashley so eloquently laid the foundation, I'll give a little bit more detail on some of the issues. So my name is Miriam Rollin, pronouns she, her. I do direct the Education Civil Rights Alliance, convened through the National Center for Youth Law. Next slide, please. The ECRA includes a number of member organizations, including AFT and NEA, the two largest teachers unions, as well as a number of civil rights organizations, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, National Women's Law Center, Lambda Legal, MALDEF, ACLU, Southern Poverty Law Center, et cetera, many others. Next, please. As part of our work addressing education civil rights, we quickly realized that it's really essential to partner with educators in this work. We can get legislative changes, we can get policy changes, we can get court decisions, but really what matters is what's happening in the classroom to our students. And so we partner with educators. One of the ways we do that is through the Leading Educator Ambassadors for Equity, who are amazing, passionate educators, award-winning educators who really believe that equity for our most marginalized students is a crucial part of what our education system needs to achieve. And so they work in the classroom for equity, but also in the media with other educators and with policymakers as well. Next slide. Another way that we've partnered with educators is we were thrilled to do this joint paper on police in schools recently with AFT. The link is in the materials. So thank you, AFT, for doing that with ECRA. A lot of the information, next slide please, that I'm going to be covering is going to be drawn from that joint paper. But one piece of context just about the growth of schools with security personnel present each week. You can see this chart, you can see the growth over the years, but two things that I want to point out, two jumps. One big jump was between the 96-97 school year and the 05-06 school year. And that coincided with two things happening during that period. The first is responses to the multiple victim shooting at Columbine High School, among others, and then federal funding, an infusion of funding for law enforcement through the COPS program, through the '94 crime bill, but then more specifically through the COPS in Schools grant program in 1999. In fact, by late 2012, the Department of Justice had awarded more than $720 million in funding for more than 6,300 school resource officers. Then you'll see another jump between the 13-14 school year and the 15-16 school year. That coincides with schools and policymakers responding after the Sandy Hook shooting. Next slide, please. So what happens when police officers or security officers are in schools? Well, they arrest. So there's higher arrest rates in schools with SROs. But in particular, what I want to point out with this slide from the research is what types of arrest? Are these school shooters that we're arresting? largely no, it's actually disorderly conduct charges, which basically, as Ashley was describing earlier, means adolescents being adolescents. It means being non-compliant in some way with some directive that some adult felt was appropriate. And next slide, please. Then the question is, okay, with all these arrests, who's being arrested? And I want to show this slide from the GAO report related to the CRDC, Civil Rights Data Collection data. And if you look on the right-hand side, the two graphs on the right-hand side, referrals to law enforcement and school-related arrests, you see the disproportionality by race. So the red big bars on the right of the line are Black students. So that's to what extent are they overrepresented in terms of referrals to law enforcement and school-related arrests. And then you look at the white bar at the top, that's white students. That's the extent to which they're underrepresented. And separate research has shown that the differences in most cases are not attributable to different levels of misbehavior. Next slide, please. So in terms of who's arrested, we also need to look at kids with disabilities. So if you look at this also from the GAO report based on CRDC data, you can see in the third bar down, referrals to law enforcement, and in the last bar, school-related arrests, this is the percentages by which kids with disabilities are overrepresented. So about over 15% overrepresentation in both referrals to law enforcement and school-related arrests. And of course, if you look at the intersectionality between kids with disability and Black kids, then you really have huge overrepresentation. Next slide, please. Also, in terms of who's arrested, I just want to point out, in this country, between 2013 and 2018, more than 30,000 children under the age of 10 were arrested in the US. In fact, just in the last year of that data collection, over 3,500 children under age 10 were arrested in the US. And if you have the stomach for it, you can look on YouTube and see the video. There's actually a couple of videos of 6-year-old African-American girls dragged in handcuffs from schools by police as a result of basically having a fit or having some kind of misbehavior. Next slide, please. So why do we have police in schools? Well, again, you saw the data overall about the increases in the numbers of school police. We specifically have the justification given that school shootings are the reason why we want to make sure we have police in schools. If you look at the number of homicides of youth age 5 to 18, about 1% of them occur in schools. So if we're really serious about addressing kids dying, perhaps we should look elsewhere than schools. Next slide, please. But do they work? Do school resource officers actually make kids and teachers and others in schools safer? The best research that's been done is recent research. It was published July 2020 by one of the most respected criminologists in our country, Denise Gottfredson at University of Maryland. She concluded, as a result of looking at the research on this question, the study findings suggest that increasing SROs does not improve school safety, and that by increasing exclusionary responses to school discipline incidents, it increases the criminalization of school discipline. So there you have it, lots of harms from arrests, and it doesn't make people safer. Next slide, please. But what does it do in addition to the arrests? Well, having police in schools, there's a lot of restraints happening in schools. So nearly 87,000 children in just the most recent year were subjected to physical or mechanical restraints. And again, disproportionality for Black students, for students with disabilities. And then, as Ashley talked about already, the assaults by police are numerous. Unfortunately, there's no official national database of police attacks on students in schools. There should be, but there is not. But she referred to, and I will also refer you to the Advancement Project and AEJ's hashtag assault at map, and to the GGE's specific gender work on that. And then finally, many African-American students, for all the reasons discussed above, are understandably report that they feel less safe when they're in schools with SROs. Next slide, please. So what's the downside in addition to all of that? Money. So budgets are really documents of our priorities. Well, 1.7 million students attend schools with police, but no counselor. That's a statement of our priorities. Schools report having more than 27,000 SROs compared to 23,000 social workers. That's a statement of our priorities. Of course, who does this fall on? Mostly kids of color. So Black students are 3 times more likely to attend a school with more security staff than mental health professionals. And school police are expensive, don't doubt that. So the Los Angeles School Police Department, before recent changes, had a budget of $70 million. That's $70 million in funding that's not going to education, counselors, mental health professionals, and support services. So what actually works? Next slide, please. There are evidence-based approaches that actually improve student safety, and that includes things like culturally affirming, and it has to be done in a culturally affirming way, positive behavior interventions and supports, restorative justice, social emotional learning, empathic discipline, and frankly, schools just complying with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act for kids that do have emotional disabilities and need behavioral supports. Next slide, please. And just to close, wanted to let you all know that it's very exciting. Last week, we had a new federal piece of legislation introduced, the Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act. Links are in the material, so please take a look at that. And with that, I thank you very much for your time, and I will turn it back to Ashley.
Thank you so much, Miriam R. I appreciate you laying out the data and the research about the impact of the presence of police in schools. So what I hear you, some of the data you talked about earlier, one of the things I wanted to highlight, sort of that when there's police presence, they're in use. And, you know, the expression I've heard in this context before is, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so when the resource or the response to student needs is policing and funding of school policing, then that is the tool that's going to be leveraged every time there's a challenge or a harm. And instead of investing in the types of tools and resources that can be much more effective at meeting young people's needs. With that, I would like to invite a younger person to take up space, as much space as you want in this conversation. Miriam S., I would love for you to take a few minutes to talk about your work and your connection to the work around police-free schools.
Hi, everybody. I just want to thank everybody for showing up today, and I invite us all to take a collective breath, because I feel like there was a lot of information that just came, and I'm also going to be sharing some personal experiences. So I just definitely want to be mindful of everyone's capacities before I start. But hi, my name is Miriam. I'm an immigrant from Azerbaijan, and I was fortunate enough to spend all my years in the DOE. I started from kindergarten, and I graduated in 12th grade from Brooklyn Tech. But Brooklyn Tech carries a very specific reputation, and it kind of sent me into the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And personally, from my activism in high school and my experiences by seeing the disparities of just that specific school, it was enough for me to kind of very specifically pursue legal solutions for young people. Right now, I'm a paralegal at Integrate and the Peer Defense Project, because all my life has kind of informed my work. And I want to start with acknowledging that I do have had the privilege of testing out of my zone schools. And those are often the schools which depend much more heavily on policing, as opposed to investing their resources in either culturally affirming responses or actually asking youth what they need to have a substantial and holistic education. But nonetheless, over the course of my work experiences and reflecting with my peers, the conversation always comes to the fact that not only do policing bodies impact students in a very violent way, but by having adults depend on police and having that kind of threat of command almost, where that is a resort that is even considered, has always left students very hesitant to find help, whether it is like with a police officer, with a teacher, or with a guidance counselor, because the understanding that police are in schools automatically jeopardizes any kind of reach for help. My specific experience with police was not actually inside my school. It was with a truancy van parked on the corner of my high school. Brooklyn Tech is located in downtown Brooklyn, and it's not far from the Metro Tech area, which has the federal courts, I believe, or the state courts. And there is generally a lot of policing in that area. And there are also many high schools. But what I found in my experience was young people were getting stopped all the time. And the young people who were being stopped, I went to Brooklyn Tech, which is a predominantly white and Asian school, but there are Black students in a very small minority, which is a whole problem of segregation separately. But because the police officers were stationed there, they were only calling out Black and brown students for truancy and stopping students of color when it was not even an act of truancy. I want to be very conscious of definitions, and I want to be very specific with the fact that police are not the bodies who will help a student if they are late to class, right? They're going to be wasting their time. But specifically in my situation, our school had an irregular schedule. Like some people started way earlier and some people started way later. Like I started at around 9:30, and in the mind of a police officer, that's late. But for students getting to class on their own time and doing it responsibly, getting stopped by a police officer who thinks that you're doing something wrong becomes not only a stressful situation, very emotionally impactful and traumatic, but in that moment and in that space, you're actually being deterred and stopped from going to class and actually attending your educational space, even though you did literally nothing wrong. And I think like this is like very egregious to me because, you know, truancy stories hover everywhere among young people. Like we're always on the lookout for police officers when we already are doing the right thing. So to be then worried that something's going to jeopardize you from getting to the place you're going, and especially for Black and brown students who were stopped, that reality in and of itself should be demonstrative of the fact that there cannot be a punitive body responsible for seeing through the development and the coming of age of a young person. Like these are going to be our community members, and we're starting their life with stress and trauma, and that impacts you psychologically for the whole duration of your life. And if you can't even be free off the campus of your school on the walk into that building, the stress that meets you inside and the violence of either police having metal detectors or simply being stationed with a firearm on your campus provides a whole different idea of violence as opposed to safety. Ultimately, it is integral to continue to have conversations like this with DOE alum and students who are actively enrolled. And I'm now 4 years removed from high school. Like I'm a college student and I've been doing this work with my peers and I've been learning, but at the same time, some of my knowledge is a bit outdated. And I think that ultimately when we have these conversations, it's really, really important to center young people, like as young as you can go and wherever they're enrolled, because we all have the experience of police officers being on our campuses and being the deterrent from us finding help when we're overwhelmed in any other situation, because we know that either we're in jeopardy, our parents are in jeopardy, or our communities become jeopardized once we involve that kind of body. And before I pass it off to Ashley, I just want to invite everybody to think about what is it that makes you feel safe and secure? And before we actually are able to manifest that, what kind of tools and what kind of legal strategies can we afford to young people to kind of move through that? A lot of my work focuses on movement lawyering because I believe in moving like institutional resources out of the hands of the institution. We have these egregiously elitist spaces that are built on white supremacy, and without inviting people from the community and without constantly displacing that power and inviting the voices who are directly impacted, these changes won't occur. So I really appreciate y'all helping me come up here and talk to y'all today, and I'll pass back to Ashley for any other folks.
Thank you so much, Miriam. First, thank you for that collective breath. I think you slowed me down and encouraged all of us to be thoughtful in the way that we engage in this conversation. So I just really, really appreciate you reminding us. I needed that breath. Really appreciate it. And you know, it's actually interesting that you said that, because that is one of the practices that restorative practitioners use in schools to create the kind of environments where students feel safe, they feel heard, where students who are experiencing trauma, students who are experiencing just like a lot of stress, emotions, one of the things that they have access to are people who can teach us the practices that help us manage our emotions, that help us manage conflict, navigate difficult situations. And many schools don't have those kind of resources, and students don't get access to the type of language and support that allows them to show up as their best selves. And so thank you so much for that reminder. And then also so much for sharing what you experienced and what you saw in New York City schools. With that, I want to just remind people, I see a lot of questions coming up in the chat. If you have a question, please put it in through the Q&A function, and that will allow me to see it. And when it's time for Q&A in just probably about 20 minutes, then we'll shift to those Q&A questions and give people people on the panel opportunity to answer them. So just a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A and not into the chat. In the chat, we will be putting resources, some of the links that we're referring to, some of the interactive map that I referred to, state studies, data, et cetera, et cetera. So that will all be in the chat. Questions go in the Q&A function. And with that, I would love to switch to Ky'Eisha Penn for you to tell us about your work at Advancement Project and the Police Free Schools movement.
Awesome. I'm going to screen share, so just give me a second to get that up. All right, awesome. Once again, my name is Ky'Eisha Penn, and I'm a staff attorney at Advancement Project National Office, where I work with the Opportunity to Learn team, which is an incredible team who has been working towards ending and dismantling the school to prison pipeline, and also dismantling school policing infrastructure in schools across the nation. So we work with several different grassroots and community-based organizations that center young people across the nation to not only work on dismantling school to prison pipeline, but for the purposes here, create police-free schools and make that a reality. Many people think that police-free schools just means removing law enforcement from schools. However, it means so much more. That's just a piece of the puzzle. So not too long ago, young people, community-based organizations, grassroots organizations that we work with and are a part of the National Campaign for Police-Free Schools, in partnership with the Alliance for Educational Justice and Advancement Project National Office, gathered and actually came up with a definition for police-free schools, as you can see on the screen. I'm just gonna go ahead and read that for you all. And it says, dismantling school policing infrastructure, culture, and practice, ending school militarization and surveillance, and building a new liberatory education system. And as we've seen with the uprisings this past year, there has been a large movement for police-free schools, and many people have been brought into this space. I know that Miriam already briefly went over, well, not briefly, went over the data that supports why we need to have police-free schools. So I won't go too much into detail here, but we do know that it's students of color who are always bearing the brunt of having police in their schools, and a lack of resources. So we've seen that there's been a defunding of educational resources for decades, and now there's this uproar for the defunding of police officers and getting police out of schools. So our organizations have spent the last few years highlighting the need for police-free schools across the nation. And with that, we believe that in order for students to actually thrive, truly thrive in schools, their educational and socio-emotional needs has to be met. And that's met by those who have the most qualifications. So there's a lot of times we expect police officers to address more intricate, issues within schools that probably actually need counselors or social workers or mental health behaviorists or violence interrupters. And we know time and time again, this is not something that we can rely on police officers to provide because often in situations they escalate particular incidents on campus while these other professionals are actually trained, have the training, anti-racist training, trauma-informed practices and training to actually deal with these situations and de-escalate them. So we know that the same police officers who are killing Black and brown people in the streets are actually no different than the police officers who police, surveil, and assault students in schools. So with the Advancement Project and a lot of the different organizations that we partner with, our work is actually grounded in abolition, understanding that removing police from schools is just one step in actually removing them from our communities. It has been referenced a few times already in this session, which I'm so grateful for, the assault at MAP. So if you have an opportunity, we're gonna drop some links in the chat that reference our We Came to Learn report that was released in 2018 and the toolkit associated with that. And in that, you'll see this integrative assault at MAP. And we've been recording, assaults by school resource officers, police officers in schools since about May of 2009. And within this report that I just mentioned, it actually chronicles the violent history of police in schools throughout the United States and the ongoing harms that students, particularly Black and brown, LGBTQ, differently abled students face at the hands of school police officers. And AP has been documenting these school assaults, including physical violence, sexual assaults, and the use of chemical weapons like tear gas or pepper spray on students in schools. And prior to COVID, we know that these school-based police assaults were actually happening about once a week, which is far too many times for students to be assaulted in schools. So what do young people want? Young people want power, community control, and a liberatory education. So we want to take that power away from police officers that they have over students of color, Black youth, immigrant students, gender nonconforming, LGBTQ students, and place that control and that power back into communities, because we know that police officers don't keep students safe, but our communities keep us safe. We keep us safe. They're also calling for the building of an education system that actually reflects the things that they want to create. Police-free schools is an opportunity to dream of the type of school system and the type of schools that young people want to be able to attend and feel safe in and feel invested in. And so over the course of this past year, we actually see that young people are actually winning police-free schools. As outlined here, you see Oakland, you see Los Angeles, you see New York, and several other places that have actually been able to have some form of a win in the removal of police officers from schools. And some of these were actually places that had their own police school district departments. And I will go over some of those victories just so you can kind of have an idea of like what it took to get that and how these victories came about. So we have seen throughout this past year these historic wins, and it just lets us know that police-free schools is more than possible. So we've recently seen a win in Alexandria and Charlottesville, Portland, Madison, and several others have already taken action to dismantle school policing and equip young people with the affirming resources that they not only need, but truly deserve. These are a few of the partners that we work with in this fight for police-free schools that are also a part of the national campaign for police-free schools. And we saw in Minneapolis on June 2nd of 2020 that the Minneapolis School Board unanimously actually approved the resolution that committed to ending the district's contract with the Minneapolis Police Department to use police officers as a means of security. We saw in Denver, there was a resolution that that was voted for that removed police from schools gradually. So they were gradually phasing out school resource officers. We see the same thing in Seattle around the same time in June of 2020, where they decided to temporarily cut ties and kind of see that progression over the course of this past year as a result of the uprisings of the past year. And one of the more discussed victories that we've seen was that in Oakland, because it followed several years of activism of trying to get this win and protest and organizing. And just the uprising was a pinnacle of that movement and of that work. And they were able to actually get the contract eliminated and actually eliminate the Oakland School Police Department, which everyone has been calling a historic moment. So it's an opportunity that we have now to continue to talk about this and support those directly impacted groups and organizations who are in this fight for police-free schools, because we see victories coming time and time again, and those who are still in their fight, to make police-free schools a reality in your respective places. Just know that there's tons of resources out for you, and we're in this fight together. So I'll be happy to answer any questions following the segment.
Thank you so much, Ky'Eisha. I appreciate all of the information that you've shared. And thank you so much for sharing information about the momentum that's happening across the country and in different types of school districts and in different types of cities. Really appreciate that. And there are already some questions I see that I think I'm going to direct your way in the Q&A function. And now I am going to shift to Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, to talk about the Police-Free Schools movement and give your introductory remarks.
How are one second, let me just get my mute button. Okay, sorry, my wife just walked in. So it's very, very wet in New York right now. So I am really delighted to be with everyone, and I think that you saw from the work that Miriam R. provided, and my pronouns are also she and her, and I am, just for some context, I am the first out labor leader in the country. Now it's kind of a thing, so, but I grew up as a very closeted lesbian, and it is a very different kind of violence that I faced and fear that I faced, but it gave me a very different kind of lived experience than you may have seen from other of our leaders in the teacher union movement. And I bring all of my lived experiences with me, including the fact that I taught at Clara Barton High School in Brooklyn, New York, for several years. And the lived experiences of my kids, all of whom who are Black and brown, still are in my head and my heart every single day. And everything that Miriam S. said about what, in some ways, what happens in our streets and what happens in our schools. And I taught in New York in the 1990s, and Miriam R., it was around the time that the Giuliani was doing the, oh no, we need policing in schools. This is what was going to change everything. So it's not at different periods of time, there were different kinds of ways of basically creating a control environment, as Marianne said, and Ky'Eisha said, and Ashley said, and frankly, our membership in many ways scared to death sometimes and wanting to have that police presence. And we at different times, said that we were into zero tolerance, and we thought that was the way of creating that kind of safe environment. But I think, as you can see from from the work that we did with the Education Civil Rights Alliance, as well as from our own resolutions and our own task force right now, we have a task force on what we should do in terms of security in schools we've had two very important inflection and pivot points. Number one was the move away from zero tolerance. And the data that Miriam R. just showed today, and I think Ashley showed as well, it's vitally important in terms of basically being able to then see that the practices disproportionately hurt Black and Brown and trans youth. And when we see those practices, we as a union and frankly as educators throughout the country said, something's wrong here, we cannot do this. We have to disrupt this comfort zone, which we then see later on doesn't make schools any safer. And so the second pivot point, which I think was really important this summer, and I say this as we have helped fund the work at George Floyd Square and the teachers who have kept that square, the teachers who were teachers of the young lady who got now a Pulitzer because of her video of the murder of George Floyd. And so the second pivot point, the second inflection point, was that this summer we basically said, last summer I should say, while we believe security is important in schools for a safe and welcoming environment, we believe schools should separate policing from school security. And we said that in a unanimous resolution last summer. And we have a task force now of educators and community groups to figure out what that means. Now, a lot of what everyone has said, this is the good thing about going last, a lot of the ideas are really, really important in terms of guidance counselors and restorative justice practices and all of that. But we have to make all of this the habits of the mind and the culture of the place to ensure that we actually have a safe and welcoming environment. And so part of that is resources, and part of that is policy, and part of that is also resources on the streets in terms of what policing looks like on the streets, not just what security looks like in the schools and what safe and welcoming means in terms of the schools. So we are working on all of these things at the same time and working with our communities all over the country. You know the differences in terms of what people have done between UTLA, for example, and other places who are working in New York. The UFT is working on trying to work with community groups about what that looks like in schools. But at the end of the day, we need to make sure that every single student, and then every single staff member, but starting with every single student, feels safe and welcome. And their families feel safe and welcome, and that we have the resources to be able to do that, the emotional resources, the social resources, as well as teachers having the muscle to be able to know what restorative practices mean, how to deal with all that happens in schools, and how not to call in police when police will actually make the situation far more worse, as Marianne S. just said earlier in the program. Now, the other thing I would just like to layer on this is the following. We also have to make sure that we have really good programs in schools so that kids are not bored, that we have project-based instruction, that we have the kind of curricular work that's really important as well. And so part of what we're fighting for is not just the resources, the guidance resources, the social work resources, the after school resources, the restorative justice resources, but how to make sure that we have really robust music and art and career tech ed and other kind of pathways, including robotics or the kind of debate team that I used to coach, where my kids had debate extensively and could compete with other schools that were disproportionately more wealthy than ours. But the last thing is we also have to have educators in our ranks that have similar lived experiences to our kids, that have that, and we have to diversify our ranks. And at the same exact time, we have to actually have the kind of the guidance counselors that we need, which are a huge shortage, the social workers that we need that are a huge shortage, the nurses that we need that are a huge shortage. So there's a lot of work that we need to do to actually get to an environment that is safe and welcoming. But first, we need to actually stop thinking that zero tolerance is the right policy. It is wrong. And we need to stop thinking that policing of children is right. That's wrong. Safety and security, of course, we need to make sure that people are safe and secure, but it has to be emotional safety as well as physical safety. And I'm saying all this in this kind of way because the educators in the country have really evolved to actually seeing things in very, very, very similar ways to the young adults who have expressed themselves on this Zoom today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your thoughtfulness. And what I'm hearing is so much, part of the conversation has been about where we were, the conversation that was happening in the 90s and the early 2000s. A lot of the people on this panel have mentioned New York City, where, which is the largest school district in the country, and the trends of, stop and frisk and the war on drugs coincided with the increase in police presence in schools. So there is definitely a conversation to be had about how the beliefs that many people held have shifted and changed. And many of us understand, as you've mentioned, Randy, that safety is not the same as policing, right? You've heard students say this, you've heard racial justice advocates say this, and I've certainly understand this now so fully, that safety, unfortunately, many of us have been taught safety equals policing, taking people, pushing them out, kicking them out of the classroom, kicking them out of the school, whatever the case may be, removing people, punishing people, and that's safety. But really, all of the research, Miriam R. mentioned, the research that's been dropped into the chat, there's so much happening in the chat, and I really, really appreciate everyone because we're about to shift. So much of the research has said the same thing over and over again. That's not safety. Safety is something entirely separate. And that's the conversation that we are all working on. And we recognize that safety happens when folks have their basic and material needs met. And I, cannot emphasize that enough. I'm obviously both a moderator and a person who knows a little bit about this subject and knows and cares so deeply about making sure that students get the support that they need and deserve. And we know that that becomes less and less possible when the resources are all being siphoned into the things that arrest them and criminalize them. So I see I want everybody to realize there have been over 25 questions, which I think I've been on a lot of Zooms and a lot of webinars and I don't get 25 questions. So I am excited, but I also want to name that we will probably not get to everyone's question. So some of them, I think some of our panelists can start to answer. If they want to type answers, I'm only going to get to read some of these questions out loud, but I will do my very best to direct the question to the panelists who might be most interested in, now we're at 27, you see what I mean? So we are obviously motivated by this conversation. There's a lot that people have to say, and just to kind of give an overview, there are people who, really think that, I see a question, I think from Leon, something about, well, what about bullying? What about the person the student who's bigger than the other students and who's bullying other smaller students? And, the belief that police can correct bullying practices or bigger students. And so I would love for somebody to answer that question. And I think I'll sort of start from, the folks who got their questions in earlier. So the first question is from Jenny Schultz. And the question is there research that shows that the long-term impact of youth having interactions with police, arrest, being questioned, even if there's no criminal record. And Jenny, I actually have a report. My colleague Charlotte Pope did a report about mitigations in New York City public schools, specifically, and how mitigations impacted Black girls. Mitigations are where a student is not arrested and they don't necessarily go into the juvenile or criminal legal system, but they have some type of interaction where a police officer, school police officer, in New York, they're called school safety agents, is invited to discipline or have some type of intervention with a student. And we see overwhelmingly that those mitigations actually impacted Black girls at extremely high rates. And they often have incredibly harmful effects on students' mental health. There was an op-ed that just went out that came from public health professionals and that I was able to co-write that specifically talks about the long-term mental and emotional consequences for students who have a mitigation or some type of interaction. Even if that interaction does not result in an arrest, it is often very harmful. And it actually, as you can imagine, increases the likelihood that they will drop out of school or be pushed out of school, really is the right term. And so each interaction increases a child's likelihood of not graduating each time they have an interaction with a police officer. And you can imagine all of the reasons why. So really happy to share that research, with you, Jenny. So Alex Corbin asked the question, are you seeing police unions push back against this type of movement to remove police from schools, or are they receptive to the criticism? And love to hear if I think Ali wants to answer the question, or figure out who wants to answer this question of the panelists about police unions. I don't know if Ali did that by accident, but either way, would love to hear maybe Ky'Eisha or Miriam, if you have any thoughts about, if not, I can happily jump in, about how police unions have showed up in this conversation.
Yeah, long story short, yes, there has definitely been pushback, and that's something that young people on the ground who are organizing for police-free schools have been met with in their fight. And it has kind of, given them some pushback, and they've had to go back and re-strategize on how to work around that. That's something that some of us are still trying to learn how to work around as we support grassroots organizations on the ground who are trying to make police-free schools a reality. So in my experience, I have not seen the receptiveness of the criticism outside of, I guess, outside of police departments, inviting people in so they can hear, complaints to see how they could reform or provide some other form of training, but not receptive to the idea of police-free schools.
And I thank you so much, Ky'Eisha. I think Randy would love to also hear your thoughts on the question about police unions.
The little secret from years and years ago is police unions, police did not want to be in schools. They never wanted, they were not trained in terms of, police haven't been trained for any of these jobs, and they didn't want to be in schools. And a lot of what happens in terms of society is we send police in to do what really should be lots of other people's jobs. And that's a whole different, so on some weird levels, early in this debate, before this past year or two, there were some police unions that one could work with. And I say this as I was the head of something called the Municipal Labor Committee in New York for 10 years and worked, with all the unions, including the police unions, were part of that. And in all of the fights over brutality and over harassment, you immediately got a very negative response, as you can imagine. But then prior to Trump, we used to be able to have some conversations. And in the labor movement itself right now, we are trying to have some quiet conversations with police unions. There's a group, I am not on it, but there's a group of African-American leaders within the labor movement who are having these conversations with police unions about standards and about conduct. And I think that at the end of the day, there's going to have to be some legal changes about reform to change the way in which things happen and occur in terms of society. But at the end of the day, police do not want to be in schools. They do not believe that that's their place, and they'd rather not be there. And that is actually something that that if there were any kind of relationships left, there could be real kind of conversations with them about that. I don't think that that answers the longer question about, Ashley, what you said before about stop and frisk and police reforms and things like that. But it is some other kind of arena that one could pursue.
Thank you. And I'm going to switch to another question. This question is going to be from Miriam R. The question is, what is the difference between an SRO, a school resource officer, and police? And can they arrest or ticket young people? Are they armed? And I think this person really just wants to understand the distinctions between SROs. And I know we're using a lot of terminology interchangeably. I know in New York City, we use school safety agent. I would push back on the safety part of that framing, but either way, the nomenclature can get in the way a little bit. And hopefully, Miriam R., you can help out with that.
Yeah, I completely agree, Ashley, in terms of the nomenclature getting in the way. And I would argue for school resource officers, one could question the extent to which they're a resource. So similar to school safety officers. So, they come by many names in many different jurisdictions. The key is, are they law enforcement officers? Do they have guns? Do they have the power of arrest? Do they have the power to detain young people? Do they have power to question young people, et cetera? And so that really is a key part of this. And one thing I would say is the amazing work that you heard Ky'Eisha describe in terms of the young people and the community organizations, just having accomplished just miracles within the last year in terms of police-free schools in the aftermath of George Floyd's brutal murder. In some cases, the jurisdictions are kind of playing a little bit of a bait and switch based on the name. So they in some places, they're kind of taking away SROs, who are normally police officers with the usual powers of police, and instead putting in school safety officers or some other type of, police light. And I think the real issue is, whatever you call them, we need to make sure that our kids are safe and supported in schools in the way they can be when the personnel there provide a welcoming environment and provide the services and supports that kids need through social workers and mental health professionals and restorative justice specialists, et cetera. And so a police officer in schools by any other name is still a police officer in schools and still carries with that person the challenges we were talking about.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. And it looks like we have enough time. So I'm going to try to get to as many of these questions as I possibly can, because I want to give folks space. When people hear police-free schools, I'm just going to be candid, there's like a little bit of panic that comes, because I think there's this belief that all chaos is going to break loose, and that students are going to just start like harming each other more and more. And so I see I hear that in some of the questions, a couple of the questions that I've read. And so I would love for someone to respond to the sort of the fear or the knee-jerk reaction that I think some people feel, that I would characterize as somewhat knee-jerk, or maybe rooted in stereotypes about students of color, and stereotypes about students of color's proclivity towards violence, which I disagree with those stereotypes. But I would love to hear if any of the panelists want to respond to or provide some maybe perspective for the folks who are holding on to those beliefs about what safety looks like, and their beliefs about who causes harm in a school or in a classroom. And any of us can hop in there. Miriam S., did you want to? Okay, go ahead.
I'm happy to jump in, but Miriam S., do you want to? So, I mean, what I would say is, look, I actually in my prior job work with a lot of law enforcement folks. And let me first say, there are a lot of law enforcement folks who are great people. we're not saying they're all evil. We're saying that there is a system that they are part of that is a law enforcement role that doesn't belong in our nurturing and welcoming schools. That's the challenge. So you have a lot of folks who think erroneously that schools, law enforcement make people safer in schools, and the research just doesn't bear that out. And so we somehow have to educate a lot more broadly about what the research is saying, and about the data in terms of the harms. And so that people can move from that place of kind of, well, I don't know, that scares me, there's going to be chaos if we take police out of schools, to a place of understanding the actual harms that are happening every day right now to students from having police in schools, particularly to our kids of color and kids with disabilities, and move beyond that to a paradigm shift that, frankly, changing the investments from police to support services for kids is one way to do it. Another way is using ARP money to provide the supports for kids that we need. The American Rescue Plan provides a great opportunity to really shift the system away from these punitive approaches in schools to provide the supports that kids actually need to succeed. Let's transform our schools to make them the safe and welcoming places that we would want for our kids, and therefore that we should want for every child.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I don't know if any of the other panelists wanted to answer that question. If not, I'll jump into another. Go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to just, add on to what Miriam R. Stated. I know that, for people even that, that I've talked to about having police-free schools, it's kind of daunting for them. But as we stated prior, that's not where it stops removing, police. We want to invest in students and invest in the schools, because we know that students are safer and are more supported when they actually have the resources to thrive in schools. So I know that someone mentioned in one of the questions about bullying, and there could be resources, there will be resources for that, whether it's, being able to talk to a counselor or address the issue with someone who is more equipped to handle that situation. When there are instances of fighting or violence in school, having restorative and transformative justice programs that, teach young people conflict resolution and, how to solve problems so that when they leave schools, this behavior is not necessarily repeated. Someone also mentioned in one of these questions about social workers and counselors not having the skill set or ability to de-escalate certain situations, but there are also community violence interrupters or violence interrupters that could be hired by the schools that are trained specifically to do that. So there are tons of resources, and maybe some of these things people don't know exist because they haven't been present in many schools that we've known about, but there is a better way to address the issues or issues that are in school, but police is not that way. They're not the answer.
Thank you, Ky'Eisha. And as you mentioned, a better way, I'm looking at one of the questions, an anonymous attendee, and I'll start off by answering this, but then I would like to shift it to Randy. This person is asking, where can a school district look to, it sounds like, to recruit and hire the types of professionals that could potentially de-escalate students if the student is in a fight or in a conflict. And it sounds like this person maybe has some experience in that profession. We are underpaid and wear a lot of hats. And this is an anonymous question, but it sounds like what they're asking is like, how can we get more staff, so whether it's a social worker and counselor? I think some of us want to even expand that frame, that there's all sorts of jobs that we could have adults from the community coming in to just be door greeters. There are elderly folks who would just love to greet students at the front door and say, hello, have a great day, instead of students being met with someone yelling at them, take off your hat, take off your belt. There's a lot of different types of roles that could be created, but then there's also some really skilled professionals that we would love to see invited into schools. And this person would like to know, how do we get those people? How do we have it so that they're not underpaid? I will share into the chat, Girls for Gender Equity created, it's like 100 pages, but there's a police-free schools toolkit specifically for educators. And the reason we decided to make this toolkit about educators and school administrators is because so much of this conversation is a lot of policy folks like me having conversations with one another, but there are people who were in the classroom who helped us create this toolkit, educators from New York City who participated and helped us develop this specifically for to share the tools that they use and the framework that they use to create the kind of conditions for police-free schools. Ky'Eisha mentioned in her presentation, abolition is about creating the conditions for safety and the conditions for healing and wellness. It's not, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, it's not about the absence, it's about the presence. So when we're talking about the presence, who do we need? I would love, Randy, if you have some space to talk about, how do we recruit those folks? How do we bring them into schools? Who are those people? And how do we make sure that they have the right kind of compensation for their skilled labor?
So, Ashley, it's a really good question, and it kind of starts with we pay for what we value, and what we've had, and Advancement Project, and we have had this kind of conversation over the course of the last 10 years. We basically have had a factory model of schools forever, and what actually made it worse was not just this sense of compliance in terms of discipline, but also compliance in terms of test scores being the be all and the end all. And so you started seeing during No Child Left Behind, as well as even the beginning of the Obama administration, that test scores became the be all and the end all, so that the money that we needed for, and we had a huge fight around the issue about no excuse schools. And so this issue about emotional and social learning being so important we had to fight to make sure that was centering what we're doing in terms of schools. I think we have gotten there. I think that there is much more of a consensus around the country about that. Now, why is that important? Because people who go into or want to go into being a guidance counselor, or want to be a school nurse, or want to be a social worker, they watch what's going on. They see, is this going to be something where, the moment that there's a budget crisis, I'm going to be fired? Or is this, I'm already going to be paid $10,000 less than, similarly skilled work in other places? So we need to create the conditions of saying that emotional and social learning are the key towards having academic opportunity. And I think that that's what is represented by, in some ways, Joe Biden's presidency, by the ARF funds that we just got, by his commitment to double Title I. So all of these things help us create a pipeline for the kind of staff resources that we need in schools. This is really important. Now we have to also diversify. We have to have those pathways. And then we have to have prototypes that really work. And there are around the country. And so, for example, community schools, which many of us have been championing for years, that's something that when you wrap services around the school, including services from community, and you keep schools open for longer than just 9 to 3, and you can have and you can do you can have the kind of programs, you start having people being able to develop the muscle to do trauma-informed instruction, to do restorative justice. Because if you only hire one great person who can do this, and you don't develop the community where the community can do this together, and you don't change the culture, that one great person is going to burn out or leave. And so it has to be the skills and knowledge of people who then help all of us develop the muscle to change the climate and change the environment. And community schools is a really good structure of how to do that.
Thanks so much for lifting up community schools. I think that's a part of the conversation that we so often forget. Community schools. As an attorney, I saw someone in the chat talking about, when was the last time you were in a classroom? It was a few years ago, but, got to visit some schools and meet clients there and support them there. And there was one school in the Bronx, it was a community school, and what they were doing was just really remarkable in terms of, there was a recording studio, like an actual music production recording studio in the school. There was a community school director who had the wherewithal, right, to invite attorneys from a nonprofit in to help students clear any tickets that they had, any summonses that they had, because he was thinking about, how can I meet my young people's needs? How can I, address things to get things off their record if I can. I just remember the recording studio as so distinctive, as like, this is one of those things that young people might really enjoy, and the students there seem to be really enjoying it. And it makes a school environment feel all the more safer because young people's needs are being met. And that was out in, if anyone knows anything about Mott Haven and in the Bronx, that there often are not a lot of resources poured into that part of the city. And so what would it look like if we had more community school models, and how does that contribute to safety? Very quickly, I want to start to shift to some of our last questions, because then I want to allow the panelists to maybe make their closing remarks. I do feel like the American Bar Association is going to share a lot of the resources that we've shared in the chat with you all afterward. This is being recorded, so people will be able to replay different things. I want to maybe, since this is the American Bar Association, I'd love to shift to a couple of quick legal questions. So some folks have been asking sort of like, what are the reforms that we can do through the law? One question is, do you think the best way to fight disparate disciplines or racially disparate discipline is with organizing and police reform, or by filing claims with the Office of Civil Rights? And the Office of Civil Rights, for those who don't know, is a part of the United States Department of Education. We call it ED for short. And so, how effective have filing claims with ED and OCR been for addressing the racially disproportionate treatment? And maybe I think this person is comparing that to organizing and policy reform. So I'm open to anyone to answer Alana's question.
I'm happy to jump in on that. In terms of the answer, is it this or that? I would say all of the above. So there is enough injustice going on for kids of color and kids with disabilities and kids at the intersection, LGBTQ kids as well. There's enough injustice going on in schools today that we need to use the policy levers. We need to use complaints for the Education Department, Office of Civil Rights. We need to have the state AGs, and we're working with 25 state AGs to try and do more in terms of addressing injustice in our education system. And so all of the above, because we really, there is no stone that should be unturned in this effort. Racial oppression and discrimination against those with disabilities is longstanding in this country and is not going to be overturned by any single type of action. It's got to be all of the above. We have to use, Title VI, which is prohibiting race and national origin discrimination in statute. We need to use the Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution. We need to use state law to protect against discrimination. All of those tools, plus policy levers. And frankly, part of it too is getting the resources directed towards where those resources need to go. And again, the American Rescue Plan is a great opportunity, but folks at the local level, because the federal rules were pretty vague, and frankly, the state plans are pretty vague. So we really need the folks at the district level to be utilizing those ARP funds to really transform educational and make it true educational justice in our schools.
Thank you so much. And I do realize we have about 10 minutes left, so just, going to start to move a little bit quickly. There's a question from Anne about the ways that schools have created or maintained safety without police. And so Miriam S., if you think about the things that made you feel safe in school that didn't involve police, would you be willing to share them? And then I know, Ky'Eisha, you are also working with organizers across the country, student organizers, and would love to hear you answer that after Miriam S. goes.
Absolutely. I had like a very specific situation with one teacher, and I think back to this a lot. I know I might be having a bit of technical issues, so let me know. You can't hear me.
We can hear you, just not that well. So if you can speak up a bit, that would be great.
Okay. Honestly, it was just I didn't like to go to the cafeteria because it was staffed with police officers, and it was a very it was a lot of students in one place, and for me, that causes me to be overwhelmed very fast, right? I've had my personal experiences with police officers, and especially after that, going into the cafeteria by itself during lunch was not something that I could do. And I had a teacher who was like, you can sit in my class. I'm going to be in the social studies department during lunch anyway. Otherwise, my alternative was to go to the library, which is actually staffed very similarly. Or like, I didn't have another place to go. If I were sitting in the halls, the police who were like on our campus, they would have asked me why was I not in class, or like why I wasn't in the cafeteria, whatever. But that teacher just meeting me where I needed him, which was like in an empty room and like leaving me alone, like that's what I needed during that year. And that like created the safety that I needed in that moment. So I'm really excited to hear what my fellow panelists have to say, but sometimes like the resources are not even like outside of like command, right? Like our schools have space, and just like being open to a conversation of how we're using that space is a lot of the times like what a student will need off rip. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Ky'Eisha?
Thank you so much for that, Miriam. And very similar to you, we try to center, or our work is centering the youth voice in our work. And time again, young people have called for the removal of police and the investment in their education so they can get a quality education in a productive and safe environment. And these young people have been calling for having particular professionals. So I recall being at a hearing for the DC Council discussing the Metropolitan Police Department budget, and young people who are currently in high school saying, you know, if I'm having a bad day, you know, for someone to talk to me. As simple as that. You know, I know that you mentioned from the assault at Spring Valley, the young girl who put her head down on the desk and didn't want to give her cell phone up. And so a situation like that, now, you know, students want to not be met with being dragged out of their chair, but, you know, maybe someone taking an interest in what's going on with them, a student having a mental break, being directed to the right resources or to the right person that can actually help them with whatever crisis that they're experiencing. We know that young people, when they come into school, a lot of them are dealing with so much more than, you know, what's going on in that school building. And they need to know that when they go into the school building that they will be supported. And that's not necessarily what's happening right now. So just hearing from young people and actually supporting and uplifting the things that they're saying will make them safe is truly important in this moment.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to start to wrap up with my closing, and then I will give it an opportunity, each panelist, to take 1 minute to say, you know, whatever it is that you want to leave today's attendees with. And so I am going to drop into the chat the link to Girls for Gender Equity's Take Action page, because we actually have 8 days, 8 hours, 35 minutes, and 56 seconds. There's a little timer until the New York City budget is finalized. I'm dropping the Take Action link in the chat. But every year, New York City, largest city in the country, decides what I heard Randy saying, like what our priorities are, right? Like where we put our money that aligns with what we value. And this year we are pushing for police-free schools. And so if you click on that Take Action link, you can click on a number of options, whether it's emailing the council members. But just to kind of give an illustration, New York City spends almost $500 million each year on school policing each year. That's not over the course of years, that's each year. And this year there was an ask from city council even to spend closer to $53 million on school-based restorative justice. And those are some of the practices that you've heard us mention today, some of the things that actually work. And instead, the mayor's counter was, how about you take $12 million? So $12 million in comparison for restorative practices in comparison to the $451 that goes to policing. And the ask was $53 million. And unfortunately, they might meet somewhere in the middle, which is still so much less than what is actually needed for restorative practices to be really funded. Randy mentioned something that I thought was really important to note, is that a lot of the practitioners who do the work that creates safety in schools, that help students manage conflict, those people are on 1-year contracts. They don't even get the type of support. They don't know that their job will be there from year to year, whereas the city spends $16 million a year over the years over training, just for training and recruitment for school police. There's nothing in comparison for training and recruitment for the types of professionals that can create holistic, healing and safe environments. There's so much work to be done. Personally, I think we have to have a conversation about the way racialized capitalism shows up in schools and in schooling. But at the end of the day, we have a short amount of time right now to do some really important work. So I hope that you all will partner with us. I dropped that link in the chat, and I will give the opportunity. I'll start with Miriam S, and then go to Miriam R, Ky'Eisha, and Randy to tell us in 1 minute or less, what you want to leave the audience with.
Thank you. So I just want everybody to really hold space for youth like y'all have done for me today, but over and over again, because young people are at the center of this conversation, and we have a very specific understanding that abolition is a positive process. You're not taking police officers out of schools, you're actually adding resources, and you're adding aids, and you're adding pathways to security and love and ability to move forward and a vision for the future. So as we move forward, having youth-led conversations, having intergenerational spaces where we're really channeling the knowledge of our elders who've seen things happen as they developed through the last X amount of years, and also the lived experiences of students right now. All of these things tied together, and in a country with the specific history that America has, it's no way around getting to a solution without tapping into the collective knowledge of communities to have these conversations. So with that, I'll pass to Miriam R.
Thanks so much, and thank you to the fellow panelists. This has been a terrific conversation, and thank you to all the participants who have hung in there for an hour and a half. Just want to add that, look, we're not talking about a unicorn school that has lightness and flowers and is wonderful every day. Schools are schools and kids are kids, but the difference is, before, when I was going to school, when there weren't cops in schools, misbehaviors were dealt with as misbehaviors. And we tried to teach kids to behave better, because just like you learn ABCs, you learn behavioral rules and you learn to follow them. And sometimes some of the rules are really stupid and we just need to get rid of them. So, schools need to adjust their approaches to be more like the schools that existed in when I was a kid and exist today, that don't have police, that don't have metal detectors, but that are actually more safe environments, because the kids need and deserve that. And as a result, we're going to have kids growing up becoming much more productive members of our communities, because they've had the nurturing and the preparation and the resources that they need when they're young to give them that opportunity to succeed when they're adults.
Thank you so much. Ky'Eisha, and then Randy.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in the inner city of Miami, Florida, where they actually have their own school district police department. So this point is something that's this issue is something that's very important to myself, because a lot of the people that we support had experiences very similar to mine, where we saw police every day. And I just want to say that justice for Black and Brown students looks like police-free schools. This is not only what they are calling for and what they want, but it's absolutely what they need. And we owe that, the momentum that we see today to the years and years of organizing by Black young people and Black organizers. And we know that we're going to continue to see it because this movement is not going anywhere. So definitely support these organizations that you see. You have, educators or administrators, have them commit and pledge to not calling law enforcement on young people in schools. We see that that's something that BOP is doing and Freedom Inc. is doing in their movement. So we would love to see that commitment from several other schools, school districts, and organizations.
So I'm really glad to be in this conversation with all of you and in community with all of you. I think that at the end of the day, teachers become teachers because they want to make a difference in the lives of young people. That's why we do what we do. And we need to all fight for the conditions that help kids thrive, as opposed to having what we have right now, which is basically a factory penalty-based model that presumes that somebody's going to do something bad, and then we're going to throw them into a school to prison pipeline. We have to change that model, and the adults have to hear children and young adults, and we have to center it on what kids need and how kids thrive. And that's why part and parcel of how we as the AFT are focused on this. This narrative is really important. And we need to be activists, but we also need to have a narrative that people can say, I buy into that, that's right. And that's why every single school should be a safe and welcoming place. Emotionally safe, emotionally welcoming, not just physically safe and welcoming. And that we need to do that for our kids. And we need to do that to make sure that we can recruit and retain the best educators, the most empathic educators, the most driven educators, so that we can all ensure that every child has the opportunity to thrive in public schools. That's what our aim is. That's what we're trying to do. And that's in some ways why we have also educated ourselves to make sure that we were out of any kind of comfort zone in terms of doing what we need to do to create that lived experience of safety for everyone and welcoming space for everyone, particularly our kids, rather than anything other than that.
Thank you all so very much. Thank you, Randy, Ky'Eisha, Miriam R., and especially Miriam S. Thank you so much for all of you for listening in. The American Bar Association section of Civil Rights and Social Justice asked me to remind you all to consider joining and becoming active with the ABA. You can do so at ambar.org/CRSJ. Thank you all so much for listening and being in this conversation. There are so many resources for you all to look through to learn more. I hope you're not overwhelmed by all of the resources. So just take your time, pick something, and really engage with this conversation and continue to support the work of organizers and young people. I hope that everyone has a safe and peaceful afternoon. Thank you for joining us.